the medical wing of the imperial palace, had never been designed for failure. It had been designed, at considerable expense, and with the input of 43 of the Empire's most celebrated architects, to communicate the precise opposite. Its corridors were wide and lit with the soft, healing spectrum bioluminescence that the Veth'kai had been using in their hospitals for 3 centuries. Its walls lined with living material that absorbed sound and released a compound shown in clinical trials to reduce patient anxiety by 62%. It smelled of ionized air and something faintly floral that the designers had spent 8 months selecting. It was, by every metric available to a civilization that had been practicing medicine longer than some species had been practicing walking upright, a place built to make people feel that everything was going to be fine. Lyarth had been screaming in it for 91 days. She was screaming now, in fact, in the way that she always screamed, not the soft, navigable crying of an infant who wanted feeding or comfort, but something that the chief physician Orath had privately begun describing in her notes as total systemic protest, because she was a scientist and scientists name things, even things that are destroying them. The sound traveled through the anxiety-absorbing walls with what felt like personal determination. 3 rooms away, a junior attendant named Savet had been keeping a tally on her data tablet of the number of distinct attempts the medical team had made to soothe the air. She was currently at 114. She had stopped sharing the number with anyone after it passed 80, on the grounds that some information was more demoralizing than useful. Orath stood at the observation panel and watched Lyarth through the transparent partition with the expression of a woman who had 17 academic distinctions and had recently begun questioning every single one of them. The infant lay in the center of a cradle that had been temperature-calibrated, pressure-calibrated, and acoustically tuned to the precise specifications of the AI Developmental Research Institute's most current recommendations. It was, technically speaking, a perfect cradle. Lyarth treated it the way she treated everything else the medical team provided, as an affront. The Empress arrived without announcement, the way she always did now, having apparently decided somewhere around day 40 that the formal protocols of arrival were a pleasantry that belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed. Severath was tall, even by the standards of her people, and the bioluminescent shimmer that ran along the ridge of her jaw and the curve of her collarbone, a trait that responded to emotion the way other species' faces responded to emotion, had been burning at a low, constant silver for weeks. It brightened when she looked through the partition at her daughter. She said nothing. There was, increasingly, not much to say. The molecular nutrition protocol, Orath began, because she was constitutionally incapable of greeting her Empress without a status report, regardless of how grim the status was. Rejected, Severath said. She accepted it for 4 days. And then she stopped. Yes, because she decided she didn't like it. Orath paused with the particular care of a physician selecting words around an Empress who had not slept properly in 3 months. Her stress indicators suggested a sensitization response to the delivery mechanism. She didn't like the bottle, Severath said. That is a simplified but not inaccurate characterization. The Empress pressed 2 of her extra-jointed fingers against the partition. Through the transparent wall, Lyarth continued her protest against existence with remarkable stamina for someone who weighed 4.5 units and had a compromised immune system. Her secondary eyelid, the one that flickered when she was trying very hard not to cry in front of her court, made 3 rapid passes. The neural soother, she said. The one physician Darrett recalibrated yesterday. Orath consulted her tablet with the energy of someone confirming information they already know and wish they did not. She removed it. She's 3 months old. She is a very determined 3 months old. Severath turned from the partition and looked at her chief physician the way a woman looks at someone when she is trying to determine whether to be comforted or concerned by that person's continued presence. Then she looked at the tablet Orath was holding, and the file that had appeared on it overnight. The one that a junior analyst had submitted at what the timestamp suggested was 4 in the morning, after what the timestamp also suggested had been a very long series of shifts. She read the name at the top. She read the species classification. She stood with it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Get him here," she said finally, and walked back the way she came, the shimmer along her jaw burning slightly brighter as she went, which could have meant a great many things but which Orath, watching her leave, chose to interpret as hope. The message arrived at the Midrim station at 6:40 in the morning, station time, which Eli Morrow knew because he had been awake since 4, and had therefore watched the hours pass with the particular intimacy of a man whose sleep schedule had been systematically dismantled by 2 years of rotating emergency shifts. He was on his third coffee, real coffee, the kind that cost more than it had any right to on a station this far from Earth, which he bought anyway because some things were non-negotiable. When his terminal chimed with the priority flag that meant someone somewhere needed something urgently enough to have paid for an encrypted diplomatic channel. He read the message once, then he drank some coffee, then he read it again. The Veth'kai Imperial Court was requesting his consultation. The Veth'kai, who had faster-than-light travel and molecular medicine, and a healthcare system that made humanity's most advanced hospitals look like a first aid kit taped to a wall. They were requesting him, specifically, by name, for a pediatric case they described in the careful and clearly painful language of people unaccustomed to asking for help, as having exhausted available internal resources. Eli sat with this for a moment. Then he sent a message to his supervisor that said he needed 3 weeks of emergency leave, attached the diplomatic summons as documentation, and went to pack a bag before anyone could tell him no. His colleague Breen, who worked the station's xenobiology ward, and had the professionally useful habit of appearing exactly when things were most complicated, was leaning in the doorway of the staff quarters when Eli got there. She looked at the bag he was already pulling from under his bunk. She looked at his face. "The Veth'kai thing," she said. "How do you know about the Veth'kai thing?" The diplomatic channel flag went through the station's central system, which sent an automated alert to all senior staff, which I am. She paused. "Also Sarin in communications told me immediately." "Of course he did. Are you going?" Eli considered this question, which felt somewhat rhetorical given that he was currently folding a second pair of trousers into the bag. "They have a sick infant who isn't responding to treatment. They asked for a pediatric specialist. I'm a pediatric specialist. You're a human pediatric specialist. They have 17 medical institutes." Apparently 17 wasn't enough. Breen was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding whether to say something. She usually decided to say it. "They're going to be strange about it, you know, the court. You'll walk in there and they'll look at you the way my grandmother looks at my father's side of the family at holiday gatherings. Like they've accepted your presence out of necessity and are choosing, very deliberately, to remain polite about it." Eli zipped the bag. "I've worked in pediatrics for 11 years. I once convinced a 4-year-old to let me take a blood sample by spending 40 minutes discussing the structural engineering of sandcastles. I can handle strange." The transport the Veth'kai sent was not what he expected, which was the first indication that the situation was genuinely serious. He had expected a mid-tier diplomatic vessel, something functional, something that communicated cordial cooperation without excessive warmth. What arrived at the station's docking bay was an imperial courier ship, which was the kind of thing usually reserved for heads of state and sensitive cargo, and which came with a Veth'kai attendant named Preth, who greeted Eli with a bow that was precisely correct in depth and angle, and then spent the first hour of the journey trying very hard not to stare at him. Eli let him stare. He ate a sandwich from the supplies he'd packed because he didn't entirely trust himself to correctly identify which items on the ship's food provision menu were edible for humans, and he reviewed everything he could find in the public record about AI neonatal medicine, which was extensive and impressive, and had not, apparently, been sufficient. The ship moved through the tunnel fold that the Veth'kai used for faster-than-light travel, which Eli had experienced twice before and which felt, from the inside, like the universe briefly forgetting what it was doing and then remembering. Preth, after a while, stopped staring and started asking careful questions. How long had Eli worked in pediatrics? What was his area of specific research? Had he worked with non-human patients before? Eli answered all of them. After the last answer, Preth nodded slowly, with the expression of someone updating a risk assessment in real time and finding the results less alarming than anticipated. "The court," Preth said, after a pause that had clearly involved some internal deliberation, "is aware that this is an unusual step." "I imagine so," Eli said. "The Empress is committed to exploring all options." "That's what the message said. That she would like me to convey that your contribution will be received with full professional respect regardless of—" Preth paused again. "Regardless of outcome." Eli looked at him. "You can tell the Empress I'm not worried about professional respect. Tell her I'd like the infant's full chart transmitted to my terminal before we land so I have time to review it. All 91 days. Preth blinked his secondary eyelid. Then he nodded and went to send the message, and Eli turned back to the viewport, and the stars moving past it, and the very specific, very familiar feeling of traveling toward a child who needed help, which was the same in every corner of the galaxy, and the only feeling he had ever found that reliably made the distance feel worth crossing. The palace was larger than the file had suggested, which was the first thing Eli noticed. And the second thing he noticed was that approximately 14 people were trying very hard not to make it obvious that they were watching him walk through it. They stood at measured intervals along the corridor in the careful postures of people who had been told not to stare, and were obeying the letter of that instruction, while absolutely violating its spirit. He caught the eye of one junior attendant who looked away so quickly she nearly walked into the wall behind her. Preth led him through corridors that glowed with the soft bioluminescent lighting he'd read about in the architectural briefs on the transport, functional, healing spectrum, chosen for its measurable effect on patient anxiety. It occurred to Eli that the corridor was almost certainly pumping that anxiety-reducing compound into the air as well, which meant the faint floral note he kept catching was pharmaceutical in nature, which he found more interesting than unsettling. He mentioned this to Preth. Preth confirmed it with the expression of someone who had never considered that a guest might notice. The medical wing's senior staff were assembled in a briefing room that had clearly been chosen for its neutrality, not grand enough to be intimidating, not small enough to be informal. Orath stood at the head of the table with 17 academic distinctions, and the particular posture of someone who has prepared extensively for a meeting they fundamentally resent needing to have. Beside her was a physician named Darrett, who was younger and therefore slightly less committed to looking like the consultation had been his idea all along. A third physician, whose name Eli immediately lost, stood near the wall holding a data tablet with both hands, the way people hold things when they are nervous and need something to hold. Eli sat down. He had reviewed the full 91-day chart on the transport. He had made notes. He put his notes on the table, which were handwritten on actual paper, and watched 3 of the 4 Veth'kai physicians look at the paper with expressions that moved through curiosity, confusion, and something close to concern before settling on professional neutrality. "It's how I think," he said, by way of explanation. "Of course," said Orath, in the tone of someone who had decided in real time that this was not the strangest thing that was going to happen today. They walked him through the case in thorough, precise, slightly defensive detail. The genetic complications, the immune architecture failure, the treatment history, every pharmaceutical approach and therapeutic intervention and neural soother and molecular nutrition protocol that had been attempted, failed, modified, reattempted, and failed again. Darrett pulled the stress indicator charts and walked Eli through 91 days of data that looked, if you graphed it, like a mountain range drawn by someone who was very upset. Every intervention, every spike, every exhausted plateau followed by the next attempt and the next spike. Eli listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions. The third question was, who has been present during the treatment attempts? Orath listed them: senior physicians, junior physicians, nursing staff, attendants, the Empress herself twice, a xenobiological consultant brought in on day 30 who had lasted 40 minutes before the screaming defeated him. All Veth'kai, Eli said. This is a Veth'kai Imperial medical facility, Darrett said, in the tone of a man pointing out something he feels should not require pointing out. Right, Eli said. He looked at his notes for a moment. Can I meet her? There was a pause around the table. Orath glanced at Darrett. Darrett glanced at the third physician, who was still holding the tablet and looked deeply unhappy about all developments. We would typically, Orath began, conduct a more thorough preliminary consultation before direct patient contact. I've read 91 days of charts, Eli said. I've been on a ship for 19 hours. I'd like to meet her. Another pause. Orath straightened slightly, which seemed to be how she indicated a decision had been made. We can arrange an observation first, through the partition. The observation partition was exactly what the architectural files had described: transparent, seamless, designed to allow monitoring without disturbing the patient's environment. Eli stood in front of it and looked through at Lyarth, who lay in the center of a temperature-calibrated, pressure-calibrated, acoustically tuned cradle, producing a sound that he felt less in his ears than in his chest. She was very small, and she was very angry, and she had been both of those things for a very long time, and something about the combination made something settle quietly in Eli's chest that he recognized from 11 years of this work. Not pity, not urgency, but the particular focus that arrived when a case asked for something other than what was currently being given. He watched for a while. Orath said something behind him about stress indicators and baseline measurements. Darrett added a clarification about the neural soother calibration. The third physician, apparently feeling that he should contribute, mentioned the nutrition protocol. Eli put his hand on the partition door. There was a sound behind him that was not quite a word but communicated very clearly, the collective intake of breath of 4 people who wanted to say something and were not certain they were allowed to. He opened the door and went in. The screaming stopped. Not gradually, not in the way that exhausted infants sometimes wound down through diminishing protest toward reluctant silence. It stopped the way a switch stops a current, completely, immediately, with a totality that made the absence of sound feel almost as loud as the sound itself. Eli had taken 4 steps into the room. He had not spoken. He had not approached the cradle. He had simply entered, and Lyarth had looked at him, and the 91 days of unrelenting noise had ended as though they had never happened. He stood very still, because he had learned long ago that stillness was its own language with frightened children, and watched her watch him. Her eyes were large and ambiguous the way her mother's were, and they were fixed on him with an expression that he had seen before on very small patients. Not the blank stare of shock, but the wide, arrested attention of an infant encountering something that their nervous system has decided, on a level far below thought, is safe. She reached toward him. It was an unmistakable gesture, the same in every species he had ever worked with, the same in every corner of the galaxy where creatures evolved to need other creatures. Arms out, fingers spread, the body asking before language existed to ask with. He crossed the room and picked her up, because that was what the reaching meant, and she settled against his chest with the immediate, absolute calm of something finding the place it had been looking for. Behind him, through the open partition door, no one made a sound. He stood there for a moment, one hand supporting her back, and felt her breathing slow against him, the rapid, distressed rhythm dropping into something steady and even, her small body releasing a tension it had been holding for 3 months. She made a sound that was not screaming. It was, improbably, something close to satisfaction. Orath was the first to speak, and what she said was not a medical observation or a status report. What she said, very quietly, in the voice of a woman with 17 academic distinctions watching everything she knew about her own field rearrange itself, was, "Oh." The explanation took 2 hours and required a xenopsychologist named Vale to be woken up at what was, for her, 3 in the morning, which she was gracious about in the way that scientists are gracious when the thing waking them up is interesting enough to justify it. She arrived with her hair unset, and her tablet already open, and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular conversation, without knowing she was waiting for it. "Pray animal evolutionary lineage," she said, pulling up comparative biology charts that she spread across the briefing room's display, while Eli sat across the table still holding Lyarth, who had not permitted herself to be put down, and whom everyone had silently agreed not to attempt to relocate. The Veth'kai had evolved in the middle of a food chain, not at the top. Their infant neural architecture still carried the deep coding of that history, threat detection systems so sensitive and so old that they operated entirely below conscious processing. The problem, Vale explained, with the focused energy of someone who had just understood something important, was that every Veth'kai in the medical wing carried vestigial biological markers from their own evolutionary history, pheromone traces, micro-movement patterns, the particular spacing of forward-facing eyes that the oldest part of Lyarth's brain recognized, without any input from reason or language, or the 3 months of evidence that these people were trying to help her, as predator. Darrett, at this point, said, "We've been accidentally terrifying her," in the flat tone of a man confronting information that was professionally humbling and personally mortifying in equal measure. "Your biology has been accidentally terrifying her," Vale said, with the careful precision of a scientist distinguishing between a person and their evolutionary inheritance. "It isn't anyone's fault. It's very old and it doesn't ask permission." Humans, she continued, came from a different architecture entirely. Different pressures, different history, different biological signature. Nothing in Eli's presence asked the ancient question that Lyarth's hindbrain had been answering, screaming, for 91 days. He didn't register as predator. He registered in the wordless arithmetic of infant threat detection as simply and completely harmless. "So she likes him because we're not scary enough," Eli said. Vale considered this. "That is a simplified but not inaccurate characterization." Orath made a sound that, in a less formal context, would have been a laugh. Severath came to the briefing room doorway and stopped when she saw her daughter. Lyarth was asleep against Eli's shoulder, one small hand curled against his collar, breathing with the steady, uncomplicated rhythm of an infant who had, finally, decided that the universe was probably not trying to kill her. The bioluminescent shimmer along Severath's jaw shifted color, not the constant silver of exhausted worry, but something warmer, something that Eli didn't have a name for but recognized, because it was the same thing he had watched cross every parent's face in 11 years of this work, in every species he had ever served, the moment the fear stopped and something else was allowed to begin. She looked at him across the room for a long moment. Then she said, very precisely, "Thank you," in the way that people say things when the words are not enough, and they know the words are not enough, and they say them anyway because they are what exists. "She did most of the work," Eli said, which was true. It was always the patient who did most of the work. The formal arrangements took 3 days. Eli would return monthly, with a small team of human pediatric staff, until Lyarth's immune architecture was stable enough to tolerate Veth'kai care, a timeline that Orath estimated at 8 months and Darrett estimated at 6 in Vale, who was now fully invested in the case and had not gone home since the briefing, estimated at 9, after which they had a spirited argument about it in the corridor that Eli found deeply reassuring, because it sounded exactly like the arguments his colleagues had at home. On the morning he left, Lyarth was awake and had just successfully rejected a new calibration of the neural soother, which Savit noted in her tally with the first genuine smile she'd recorded in 94 days. Preth brought Eli's bag to the docking bay and informed him, with great solemnity, that the Empress had arranged for an upgraded transport. Eli looked at the ship. It was considerably larger than the courier vessel that had brought him. "She wanted you to be comfortable," Preth said. "Tell her I appreciate it." He picked up his bag. "Tell her also that Lyarth pulled my collar so hard this morning she nearly had my ear, which I'm choosing to take as a good sign." Preth's secondary eyelid flickered twice in quick succession, which Eli had come to understand was approximately equivalent to a suppressed smile. "I will convey that," he said. The ship lifted out through the upper atmosphere and into the dark where the stars were, and Eli sat in a seat that was genuinely far more comfortable than the one that had brought him, with 94 days of updated chart notes and a cup of coffee that Preth had, without being asked, arranged to have stocked in the galley. He thought about Lyarth's face when she had first looked at him, that absolute, unguarded trust, the oldest and most serious thing an infant could offer. He thought about the long math of it, the billions of years of evolutionary history that had arranged themselves into this specific moment. A child who could only be held by a stranger because her own people's ancient past had made them, without meaning to, frightening. He thought about what it meant to be useful not because of what you knew, but because of what you weren't. Then he